Hey guys, we're headed back to the Eastern Front of World War II. Goodness,
The Soviet
goodness,
forces
goodness.
continued their retreat
Look at that.
behind the German
I mean,
lines,
look at how close
forced
they are
a
to
change in the
Moscow
Soviet
again.
plans.
I'm excited to be back on this Eastern Front series. We're now in 1942. Roger's excited too. A lot of you have left some really helpful comments on the first video I did on part 1 of this series, 1941. Check it out if you haven't yet. I've actually learned a lot from you guys, so I really appreciate all of the comments. I'm hoping that we'll have the same thing for this video, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of stuff in here that I don't know much about. I had somebody tell me that the numbers and the circles and squares kind of indicated divisions on either side, and then the X's indicated how many there were in that division. So at least I'll know that much watching this video. Somebody also told me that those two cities that I couldn't pronounce, I'm sorry, Russia, were cities along that line in the north and the south, which makes sense. Somebody also told me that Leningrad was a super important port for the USSR, which I can now understand why they were so intent on defending it. Also, I was told that the Soviet troops may not have been as well trained as they should have been. And I had somebody from Germany explain to me that whole flanking maneuver that the German army did where they encircled the troops. He basically said that the Soviets would concentrate their firepower on a very specific point in the line. They'd break through and they'd flank around and they'd surround the Soviet soldiers and then take them, and then that's how they kind of created these holes in the line, which is pretty brilliant. As I told you before in the previous video, I kind of like military tactics for some unknown reason, so I'd be interested to know if the German army was the one that kind of invented that maneuver, or if it's something that armies from the past had always done and they just kind of adapted it to the World War II situation. It was also brought to my attention that just because the German army might have taken Moscow, that didn't mean necessarily that the Soviet Union would have fallen, but it certainly would have made it a lot more difficult to win the war. So anyway, major thanks to all of you guys who kind of educated me on that. I am trying to keep up with all of your comments and get through them and learn from you guys. So also shout out to Eastery, which is the channel that's done these videos. You'll find the link to the original video in the description, so please go check them out. All right, let's get into it.
In 1941, the Axis invaded the Soviet Union, planning to overrun the European part
we have
of
different
it before
graphics
the
this
onset
time.
of winter. However, the resistance was stronger than expected, and by the beginning of October they had expended much of their offensive capabilities. Assuming that the Red Army was on the brink of collapse, they launched an all-out attack. The Soviet Union had still resources left, and the Axis forces found themselves
Still amazing how
overextended.
close they got
the
to
Red
Moscow.
Army was seriously weakened, but it did not let the opportunity slip and counterattacked with all available forces, forcing the Axis into a retreat. In the Black Sea region, the Soviets undertook an amphibious operation. They landed their forces in the Crimea, survived the Axis counterattack, and made preparations to take the whole peninsula. In Ukraine, they pushed towards the Dnieper River and managed to gain ground before their attack was contained. Near Leningrad, the Red Army broke a breach into the German line and pushed into their rear, threatening to unhinge their front. The Soviets concentrated most of their forces against the army group center. After having pulled back from the approaches of Moscow, the Germans decided
it's
to
so
stand
much
fast
more
and regroup on
concentrated
their
around
positions.
Moscow,
This
which
gave
makes
the Red
sense.
Army a chance to conduct an encirclement of the German forces. Overextension had created several gaps in the German lines.
Hang on,
Sorry,
I talked over him there. I don't know what he said, so we're gonna go back.
Approaches of Moscow, the Germans decided to stand fast and regroup on their present positions. This gave the Red Army a chance to conduct an encirclement of the German forces. Overextension had created several gaps in the German lines, and Red Army exploited them in order to bypass and cut off the German units. Despite of moving behind the German lines, they did not have enough strength to cut the main railway supplying the German forces, and the Germans were able to cut off and contain the breakthroughs. In the north, the Soviets encircled the German Second Corps at Temiansk, but it was sustained by air supply. After realizing that it lacked the strength to conduct a major attack, the Red Army concentrated its efforts on the most promising sectors. However, by this time the Germans had
look at that right there. They have the Germans almost completely surrounded. Obviously, the Germans are defending that road right there, which I think he said was the supply line, so that they weren't able to kind of make that full encirclement there. I guess maybe they just didn't have the numbers, or they weren't able to completely carry out the tactics somehow. I'm not sure exactly why, but man, that looks like such a great opportunity to like encircle and really capture the Germans right there, and they just can't quite get there.
Secured their position, and the attacks achieved only minimal progress. After having reorganized further, the Germans were able to conduct small offensives of their own in the most critical sectors. They destroyed some Soviet units in the Army Group Center's rear and re-established the land connection with the Demyansk pocket. As the winter ended, both sides drew.
What I'm getting from this is that the German army is probably just better trained than the Soviets. They've got these tactics down just a little bit better. Because I feel like the numbers are fairly even based on the numbers I saw in the 1941 video. Of course, somebody told me that the Soviet army wasn't quite as well trained, so I'm just taking that information and assuming that that's what's going on here.
Drew up their plans for the summer. The Soviets were rebuilding the Red Army, but it would be far from ready by summer, and the Axis would still have the upper hand.
So they were able to push back a little bit.
The Soviets believed the Axis would use this to undertake a major offensive towards Moscow and prepared to take a defensive.
Sorry, let me go back.
Ready by summer, and the Axis would still have the upper hand. The Soviets believed the Axis would use this to undertake a major offensive towards Moscow and prepared to take a defensive stance. The question was what to do with the many salients that had been formed in the front.
Yeah.
They provided good opportunities for the encirclement of both the Axis and Soviet units and were difficult to defend. In order to conduct a successful defense, they would have to be eliminated. One option was to abandon the salients, the other was to destroy the Axis-held salients. Although it was not clear if the Red Army would have enough strength to do so, they decided to risk it. They would destroy the Axis forces in vulnerable positions, and this would drain the strength from the main Axis attack. After the main attack was repelled, the build-up of the Red Army would have reached a level that would allow it to go on a major offensive. The Germans were indeed preparing to carry out a major attack. Comparing with the previous year, their resources had decreased and they were unable to mount a large Barbarossa-style offensive. Instead, they planned to undertake several consecutive offensives in order to destroy the Soviet Union. As the first step, they would capture the Caucasus oil fields in order to deny the Soviet Union most of their oil supply and gain a long-term source of it themselves. This would allow the Germans to continue waging the war in full capacity.
So a question about that though, I know that Russia is a really oil-rich country. I was under the assumption that a lot of the oil was kind of in the northern eastern part of the country. Would they still have had access to that oil in order to kind of counter the Germans taking these oil fields? Or did they not really have supply lines going out to that area? Or am I completely wrong on that and there isn't really oil out there?
Capacity. Next, Leningrad would be taken, and then the Murmansk Railroad would be cut,
so cutting off
depriving the Soviet Union of
port
its main
and
sources
oil.
of foreign aid. Meanwhile, in the center, the German forces would hold their forward positions in order to provide a good springboard for an offensive. After the Red Army had been weakened by previous steps and
which
the
plan's
Axis had
gonna
freed up
prevail
their forces,
here?
they would occupy the main Soviet industrial base in central Russia. Before and during the main operations, the Axis would clear out as many of the contested areas as possible to free up more troops. The first Soviet attack was in the north, where they attempted to push the Axis forces back in order to increase the security of the Murmansk Railroad, but they failed to make any serious advances in the rough terrain and went on a defensive. The next operation was meant to destroy the most vulnerable German salient at Demyansk, but the Germans continued to hold on to their positions and their progress was minimal. The next operation was undertaken by the Axis in the southernmost part of the front. In the Crimea, the open steppe suited well for close air support, and the Germans used it to break through the Soviet lines. The Red Army had previously conducted several offensives, and its forces were deployed forward, lacking the depth to contain the Axis breakthrough.
I guess the German army was just that much more well trained.
Abandon the peninsula. In Ukraine, the Soviets had finished their preparations first and went on the offensive, attempting to take Kharkov with a two-pronged attack. The Axis forces were not far behind in their deployment, and 5 days after the beginning of the Soviet attack, they went on an offensive of their own. The Red Army did not anticipate such a move, and the German units managed to cut off the attacking Soviet troops and destroy them.
I mean, they are just like masters at that.
The Soviets were
crazy.
unable to fully exploit their breakthrough. Having realized the vulnerability of their position, they decided to evacuate the salient. However, the Germans beat them to it and cut the neck of the salient. During the next month, the encircled Soviet forces were eliminated. In the center, both the Soviets and the Germans were preparing.
I mean, by this point, I would think that the Soviet army would realize, you know, how to kind of maybe defend against that tactic, because that's all the Germans are doing. They're just breaking through, encircling them, and eliminating them. I mean, surely they had to be wise to that move by that point. Were they just not able to counter it, you know, for some reason? See, these are the little things with the military tactics that I'm always curious about.
Preparing their own offensives. As the German operation was of smaller scale, it was ready first, and they proceeded to clear out the pocket south of the railroad. Soon, they had full control over the territory, although part of the Soviet forces managed to escape and reach their main lines. After having regrouped their forces, they turned against the northern salient.
Is there a story about that right there?
With the main Soviet front and pushed into it, eliminating most of the Soviet units.
Oh my gosh.
Destruction of the Red Army formations behind the German
lines.
Look
at how close they are to Moscow again.
And their offensive in the center was postponed. In the south, the failure of the Kharkov offensive had left the Red Army in disarray, and the Germans decided to exploit the opportunity. They conducted 2 smaller attacks, but this time the Soviets pulled their forces back and did not offer strong resistance. The amount of prisoners taken was limited.
I mean...
Now everything was ready to carry out the German plan to capture the Caucasus. As the first step, the Axis forces would encircle and destroy the Soviet
German plan is the one that's prevailing so far.
Then they would advance and take strong defensive positions along the Volga and Don rivers to cut the communications between the Soviet heartland and the Caucasus. This would shield the Axis forces in the south from the main force of the Red Army. As the third step, the Axis forces would move into the Caucasus and take over the oil fields. The first German attack reached the Don River as planned. The Soviets expected that they would turn north towards Moscow and deployed their reserves, conducting a counterattack from this direction. In the south, the Red Army began to withdraw to avoid encirclement. Because the German plan was founded on the assumption that the Soviets would avoid defeat, as they had done in the previous year, they were now confronted with the possibility of Soviet forces escaping the encirclement. They altered the plan, sending the forces immediately to the south in order to catch the Soviet units. However, the Soviet formations further south joined the retreat, allowing most of them to escape the encirclement. By this time, the Soviet command had understood the German intentions and had deployed their strategic reserves to keep the Axis away from the Volga River. Meanwhile, their other forces retreated south over the Don. During that time, the Germans had also captured...
It's just so amazing how a geographic feature like a river can help armies, you know, kind of hold off an enemy like that. Because then you have to figure out how to, I guess, build a... I mean, I don't know that river. I don't know how deep or how wide it is or anything. It definitely, I guess, would slow them down because they would have to figure out how to get a bridge across that river. Or maybe there were bridges and they had to figure out how to take those. I'm sure there are hundreds of like individual stories about all of this. I'm just watching this and it's just such a broad, quick overview. But I imagine that there are some like really detailed stories about some of these battles and so forth. And I'm sure there are a lot of battles that have names and stuff in here that we're not getting in this video. Man, it's just so much to learn about this.
Also captured Sevastopol, and when it was clear that the Caucasus direction was properly covered, they sent their freed up forces north to take Leningrad. In the central part of the front, the Germans were finishing the preparations to destroy another Soviet salient. But before that, the Red Army had finished deployment and commenced its offensive against the Army Group Center. The Germans reinforced the defenses and then attempted to cut the southern Soviet salient with weaker forces, but were unable to. The terrain in the area of the Soviet attack was not suitable for their use of heavy weapons, and the main brunt of the fighting fell to the infantry, which suffered heavy casualties. Despite pushing the Germans back, they were unable to destroy their forces. Limited attacks continued for a month more, but they failed to secure more territory. In the north, the Germans planned to use reinforcements from the Crimea to cut off Leningrad. In addition, they planned to undertake several operations in order to improve their defensive positions. The Red Army was meanwhile preparing to re-establish the land connection to Leningrad by pushing through the thin strip of the German-held territory. The Soviets attacked first, and the Germans had to use the reserves to repel them. The defense tied up their forces, and they lost the time they needed for the encirclement of Leningrad. In addition, they could spare enough troops only to widen the neck of the Demyansk salient. In the south, the Axis had failed to destroy the Soviet formations opposing them, but in the same time, the quick retreat had thrown the Soviet forces into disarray, putting them in need of reorganization. Meanwhile, the Axis troops were left unscathed. The Germans decided to solve the situation by not allowing the remaining Soviet...
Okay, I just noticed for the first time that some of these circles have different flags in them. So I'm seeing the, I think, Italian flag. I'm sorry, I don't know the flags super well in Europe. I don't know what that, like, 6 in the middle right there with the blue, yellow, and red. I'm not sure which country that is. So I'm seeing like maybe 4 different types of circles here. Somebody did tell me that it wasn't just the Germans, that it was a mixture of the German army and then some of these other European armies as well. So I'm just now picking up on that. Sorry.
Soviet units to reorganize and moved immediately towards the Caucasus, while the other part of their forces would secure the flank. The Soviet forces continued their retreat.
Look at that! There's like almost nobody right there.
There they made a stand and dug in on the bottlenecks. In the north, the Germans used the open steppe terrain to outmaneuver the Soviet reserves and moved slowly towards Volga. By the end of August, they...
I don't know anything about Stalingrad. I do know that it's a pretty famous city in the USSR. What was the importance of Stalingrad? And I feel like, I could be wrong, but I feel like that there is a big, huge battle that took place in Stalingrad, and maybe we're going to get into that in these future videos. What was the strategic importance of Stalingrad for the Soviets?
They had reached the river and entered the city of Stalingrad and began to slowly clear out the city. In the Caucasus, the German Alpine troops traversed the mountain passes, but they lacked the strength to reach the sea and were stopped on the southern slopes. During the following months, the spread out Axis forces continued to make small gains. Although the Axis had made serious advances, they were unable to deliver a crippling blow to the Soviet war effort and decided to complete their objectives in the next year. They anticipated that the Soviets would have enough strength for a winter offensive in one sector and that they would attempt to destroy the salient in the central part of the front. The Germans countered the threat by deploying their reserves.
Well, I mean, it's autumn now. They know winter's coming up. They know that that's when the Soviets are going to probably have that upper hand, so they got to start thinking ahead about all of that.
Meanwhile, in the south, the Axis forces attempted to improve their positions as much as possible before the onset of winter. They tried to cut off the Red Army units in the Black Sea coast, but they could not break through the hills. In the central Caucasus, the Germans caught the Red Army off balance and moved deep into the hills until the Soviets redeployed their units. After that, coming off the winter snow...
I don't know anything about the geography in this region. I don't know what present-day country this would have been in, this little part right here. He said that the oil fields were down here, but I don't know where they are, and I don't know how close the Germans are to actually taking them here. But this looks like a mountain range. What mountain range is this? What country would this be currently?
Put an end to the offensives in the Caucasus. By the Volga, the Axis forces had advanced steadily during the last months, and in the middle of November, they were in the process of removing the last Soviet presence in Stalingrad. They were not expecting a major attack in the south, and instead of creating a defense in depth, the forces of the Axis flank were deployed offensively, concentrating in the east at the point of effort.
Again, we're seeing all of these different countries in the circles here. I'm wondering, they've been super effective in their tactics against the Soviet army. Did they do a lot of joint training, all of these different armies from these different countries, so that they were all on the same page? Or how did they go about doing that? Did the Germans kind of lead the offensive and just kind of tell the other armies what was happening and what to do?
Effort. In this situation, the Soviet breachheads over the Don were considered of secondary importance and were covered by Romanian forces, who lacked anti-tank equipment and were not keen on fighting.
Wait, I didn't hear what you said about
the Soviet
Romania?
deployed offensively, concentrating in the east at the point of effort. In this situation, the Soviet breachheads over the Don were considered of secondary importance and were covered by Romanian forces, who lacked anti-tank equipment and were not keen on fighting. Contrary to German estimations, the Red Army had the forces to conduct 2 winter offensives. They had deployed their second force in the south to make full use of the Axis.
Whoa. If I'm reading that right, the Soviets are outnumbering the Germans by almost 3. I didn't expect that.
The Axis deployment in this sector. The Red Army managed to achieve surprise and overran the Romanian forces opposing them. Then they broke into the undefended Axis rear, cutting off their forward units. Next, they had planned to reach the sea and cut off all the Axis forces in the Caucasus region. However, some of the Red Army forces had to be diverted to repel the German attempt to relieve the Stalingrad pocket, and the
So I'm assuming that the Germans are just kind of holding Stalingrad at this point. They look surrounded by Soviet troops. So are the Soviet troops kind of laying a siege to Stalingrad at this point, just kind of trying to wait them out? I know that there's got to be like tons of stories and books and videos about Stalingrad by itself. It just rings a bell to me. That's really interesting.
The advance could not be conducted to full extent. The year in the south ended with the Soviets crushing all Axis hopes to sustain their forces in the Caucasus and Stalingrad, and were threatening to advance into Ukraine. At the same time, the Red Army was attempting to cut the German salient in the center. The Germans had deployed their reserves and were prepared for the attack. The Soviet attacks were met with staunch defense, and where they were able to penetrate the German defenses, they were thrown back by counterattacks. The Soviet offensive failed to achieve its objectives, and only in the western sector did the Red Army achieve some success. Thus, 1942 came to an end. The Soviets had secured the oil, and now the Wehrmacht lacked a proper plan to defeat the Soviet Union. The Soviet forces were moving west with the hope to inflict a decisive defeat on the Axis. At the same time, the Germans attempted to save the situation and create a stalemate. Whether they are successful will be decided in the next year. There is another question. How could I animate so many divisions? Well, I couldn't have done this without my patrons on Patreon, and I would like to thank them for their support. If you want to help the channel out...
Yeah, so actually that last little bit where he talked about animating all of this stuff, I had somebody tell me that that might have been like a war game and he was using that for the animation. So if you know if this is an actual game that he was using, let me know. I'm not a gamer personally, but I'm just kind of curious about how he made this video. I don't know about you guys, but I am super enjoying this series on World War II, the Eastern Front. It's not just learning about the overall story of it, but it's also getting into like the nitty-gritty details of all of the tactics of the individual divisions, the different strategies of each side, and seeing them play out and seeing who was successful and who wasn't. It looks like the Soviets kind of eventually caught on to the German tactics and they started coming up with ways to defend against them. And so it's definitely looking like in 1942 the tide turned just a little bit towards the Soviet side and they're now able to take more of an offensive against the Germans. I see the German army, or the Axis army I guess as I should be calling them since there are multiple countries involved, they're starting to break down just a little bit here. So I've been kind of curious to know exactly how all of that happened. Did the Soviets just start bringing in more soldiers and it became harder and harder to take an offensive against them? Was it that they started adapting to the tactics of the Germans? Was it because the Soviets decided to go from the defensive to more of an offensive in some of these situations? Maybe it was all of the above. Maybe it's something I'm not even thinking about. So please let me know down in the comments. The 1941 video has gotten a really great response. It seems like a lot of you guys really love the World War II stuff. World War II is actually my favorite kind of war to study. I don't know what it is. I think it's because it was considered really the first modern war where we started using more technology. The tactics and the strategies were different, and it was just like this epic scale, right? So anyway, guys, we have the other two parts coming up. We've got 1943, I believe, and then I think you combine 1944 and 1945 into one of the videos, or maybe it was the other way around. I'm not sure. I'm really enjoying this series, and if you enjoyed this video, please do like it and subscribe so you know when the next two parts come out. They will be coming out very soon. I'm kind of doing this series every other video because there are some other things that I want to fit into this week. I gotta say, this is one of the best ways to learn history, watching it and conversing with you guys online. Alright, so we're done. Say goodbye, Roger. Stay tuned, guys, as always, and we'll see you next time.